What if I told you that the toughest human endurance machine ever built didn't come from a lab, didn't come from a military training program, and didn't come from any modern science of peak performance? What if the most efficient, relentless, fatigue-resistant body ever developed in the American story was forged not by choice, but by a landscape that left absolutely no room for weakness? No protein shakes. No recovery pods. No GPS to track your route. No insulated sleeping bag rated for 30 below. No paved road. No weather app. No guarantee that what was alive yesterday would still be alive tomorrow. And yet, somewhere between the Rio Grande and the Powder River Basin, a class of human being emerged who could ride for 18 hours straight, work a full cattle drive under a sun that cracked lips and cooked leather, sleep on frozen ground without complaint, and then do it all again the next day. 4 months. Think about that for a second. Not because they were superhuman. Not because they didn't feel pain. But because the Wild West, in all its brutal and indifferent glory, had quietly engineered something that modern science is only now beginning to understand. A system of physical and mental conditioning so complete, so integrated, so demanding, that exhaustion itself had no place left to live. This is not a story about toughness as a personality trait. This is a story about a system. A forgotten system. One built not from ambition, but from necessity. And once you understand how it worked, you will never look at fatigue the same way again. Imagine standing at the edge of a cattle camp somewhere in the open country of what would become Wyoming or Texas. The sky is enormous. The kind of enormous that makes you feel like the earth has no edges. The wind comes in low and dry, carrying dust that settles in your teeth, your collar, your eyelids. The temperature dropped hard overnight. Your boots are still damp from yesterday's river crossing. There is no tent. There is a fire, barely. There is coffee, black and thick enough to stand a spoon in. And there is the sound of 300 cattle already starting to stir in the gray pre-dawn. You have been asleep for maybe 4 hours. You are about to ride all day. And somehow, by every account left behind in journals, letters, and ranch records of the era, men in that situation did not break down. They adapted. They endured. And over time, something stranger happened. They stopped fighting the conditions and started running on them. The land wasn't destroying their bodies. The land was building them. Here is what most people get wrong when they imagine the cowboy. They picture the exhaustion, the dirt, the impossibility of it. And they think, those men must have been tougher than us. Harder somehow. Different in some fundamental biological way. But that's not what happened. And here is the first thing you have to understand. The Wild West did not create tougher men by breaking them. It created tougher men by removing everything soft. There is a profound difference. Breaking a man destroys his capacity. Removing softness expands it. What looked like punishment from the outside was, from the inside of the system, a form of calibration so precise it would take decades of modern exercise physiology to even partially explain. Start with sleep. Not how much of it they got, because the answer to that is, not enough, by modern standards. But how they slept. On the ground. Every night, often without padding beyond a bedroll. Hard surfaces. Irregular schedules. The body cycling through light and deep sleep in patterns dictated not by an alarm but by the sounds of the herd, the shift in wind, the distant cry of something moving in the dark. Some researchers studying historical accounts have proposed that this kind of fragmented, environmentally cued sleep may actually promote a different quality of recovery than the consolidated, climate-controlled sleep we consider normal today. One plausible reading is that sleeping in nature, with the nervous system never fully disengaging, kept the body in a state of light readiness that was itself a form of conditioning. Not better sleep. Different sleep. A sleep tuned to the land. And the body responded. Nothing worked in isolation. That is the first rule of understanding this system, and it will be the last rule too. The sleep was connected to the movement. The movement was connected to the food. The food was connected to the stress. The stress was connected to the silence. Take any one element out, and the whole machine changes. That is what made it a system, and not just a lifestyle. Now think about the movement. Cowboys in active seasons were not sedentary. Not even close. Estimates based on historical cattle drive records suggest that a working hand might cover between 25 and 40 miles a day on horseback, with significant portions of that ride requiring active engagement, holding position, bracing against terrain, managing the horse through rough ground, dismounting and remounting dozens of times. The legs, back, core, and shoulders were under constant low-level load for the better part of every waking hour. This was not interval training. This was not high-intensity anything. This was relentless, sustained, moderate-effort physical engagement across an entire day. Every day. For months. Modern exercise science has a term for this. Zone 2 training. The aerobic baseline. The slow, steady work that builds mitochondrial density, improves fat oxidation, and creates the kind of cardiovascular efficiency that elite endurance athletes spend years deliberately cultivating. Cowboys were doing it accidentally. Not because someone told them it was good for their cells. Because the land demanded it. And over a full season, over a full working life on the range, physiological adaptation to that kind of sustained effort would have been profound. The body simply stopped treating effort as an emergency. It learned to run long on less. But here is the part that most people never consider. Here is where the system gets strange. The food. It was not good. Not by any standard of modern nutrition. Beans. Dried beef. Cornmeal. Coffee. Fat. More beans. On a good day, something fresh that the cook had managed to find or trade for along the trail. The diet of the working cowboy during a drive was calorie-dense, protein-moderate, and almost entirely lacking in what we now call micronutrients. No fresh vegetables for weeks at a time. No fruit. Minimal variety. The kind of eating that modern dietitians would classify as a fast track to deficiency and metabolic collapse. And yet, the men eating that diet were outperforming, in sustained endurance terms, almost any other class of laborer in the American story. They were not thriving on the food. They were thriving despite it, and here is the mechanism that makes this comprehensible. When the body has been conditioned through months of sustained low-intensity work to become supremely efficient at burning fat for fuel, it needs less. The metabolic machinery runs cleaner. A man who has spent a year doing slow, long work on the range is not the same metabolic creature as a sedentary man eating the same diet. The conditioning changes the equation entirely. The beans and the beef and the fat were not optimal. But for a fat-adapted, movement-calibrated body, they were enough. Just barely enough. And just barely enough, when the machinery is running right, is all a system needs. Micro cliffhanger. Because here is what almost nobody talks about. The stress. Not the stress of danger, though that was real enough. The stress of silence. The stress of scale. The stress of working for weeks in an environment so vast and so indifferent that the human nervous system, calibrated by evolution for a much smaller world, had to fundamentally recalibrate just to function. The open plains of the American West are not peaceful to an unprepared mind. They are overwhelming. The absence of walls, of streets, of familiar human markers, creates a particular kind of low-level activation in the nervous system that researchers studying historical accounts of frontier life have described as a form of chronic ambient stress. Not acute terror. Not crisis. Something quieter and more pervasive. A background hum of alertness that never fully switched off. And the body adapted to that too. There are interpretations suggesting that long-term exposure to this kind of sustained low-level stress, particularly in combination with heavy physical output and irregular sleep, may actually recalibrate the body's cortisol response in ways that reduce subjective experience of fatigue. Not eliminating tiredness. Changing the threshold at which tiredness becomes stopping. The system was teaching the body that stopping was not an option, and the body, with time, internalized that instruction at a hormonal level. Not through willpower. Through adaptation. Nothing worked in isolation. Think about the horse. Because you cannot understand the cowboy's endurance without understanding the relationship to the animal beneath him. This was not transportation. This was a partnership so integrated that the two organisms, man and horse, developed a kind of shared biomechanical language. The rider who spent years in the saddle stopped fighting the horse's movement and began riding with it, absorbing and redirecting the kinetic energy of the animal's gait through hips, spine, and shoulders in a continuous flow. The energy cost of staying in the saddle, for a conditioned rider, was a fraction of what it would be for an unconditioned one. Experienced cowboys described long days on the trail as something approaching a meditative state, the body on autopilot, the mind floating somewhere between the horizon and the herd, the whole system running at idle without awareness of effort. That is elite athletic conditioning described in the language of working men who would never have called themselves athletes. And here is where it gets genuinely astonishing. The recovery. Modern athletes obsess over recovery. Ice baths, compression gear, sleep optimization, nutritional timing. The entire industry of sports science is, at its core, an industry of recovery. Get the output right and then get the body back to baseline as fast as possible. That is the modern model. Cowboys had none of it. And yet they recovered. Night after night, with 4 hours of hard-ground sleep and a cup of black coffee before dawn, they recovered. Not fully, by any laboratory measure, but functionally, operationally, enough. Some studies propose that the body, when it has no alternative and when the systems of conditioning have been built over sufficient time, develops what might be called a compressed recovery cycle. A shortened return to functional baseline because the baseline itself has shifted. The adapted body does not need to return to the same starting point as the unadapted body. It is already operating from a different floor. The ceiling of its fatigue is higher. The floor of its recovery is lower. The gap between them, the space where work happens, is wider than most people ever develop in a modern lifetime. The Wild West didn't give these men better genetics. It gave them a better floor. Now consider the cold. Because that is its own system entirely, and it deserves attention. Winter on the open range was not an inconvenience. It was a physiological event. Temperatures in the northern plains could drop to levels that killed cattle in the open. The wind came in off the mountains with a cutting edge that no amount of wool could fully stop. Hands cracked. Feet went numb. The breath froze on a man's mustache before he'd ridden 100 yards from camp. Everything metal was dangerous to touch with bare skin, and men worked in it anyway. Not because they were suicidal. Because the work didn't stop for weather. The cattle didn't stop needing management because the temperature dropped. The horses didn't stop needing care because there was ice on the water trough. The system had no off-season that the body was allowed to use as a reason to stop. The physiological response to chronic cold exposure is well documented in modern research. Increased brown adipose tissue activity. Improved peripheral circulation. A recalibration of the shiver threshold that effectively raises the body's functional cold tolerance over time. What a man born to a warm house and regular meals would experience as dangerous cold became, for a conditioned range hand, merely uncomfortable cold. Uncomfortable. Not disabling. The body had learned to keep its core warm by running a little hotter, a little more efficiently, all the time. More fuel burned. More food needed. More sleep would have helped. But the system accounted for that, crudely, with the calorie density of the trail diet. The fat was not incidental. The fat was thermal insulation in edible form. Here is the part that should make you stop and think. Every single element of this system, the sleep, the movement, the diet, the cold, the stress, the horse, the silence, the scale, every one of them was a consequence of the environment. Not a choice. Not a training protocol. Not a philosophy of toughness. Just the unavoidable conditions of a working life in the open American West. And yet together they produced, over a working lifetime, a human body that operated at sustained high output under conditions that would hospitalize the average modern adult. Some researchers argue that we have, in the process of engineering comfort into every corner of modern life, quietly removed the stimuli that the human body uses to build its deepest adaptive capacity. Not the stimuli of extreme stress. Not the stimuli of suffering. The stimuli of sustained, moderate, relentless demand. The kind of demand that says, this is not a test. This is just Tuesday. And the body, with no drama and no announcement, rises to meet it. The cowboy didn't train for endurance. He lived inside the conditions that made endurance the only option. And the body, being the extraordinary adaptive machine that it is, did what bodies have always done when given no alternative. It figured out how to be enough. There is something deeply modern in that idea. Not because we should go back to sleeping on frozen ground or eating nothing but beans and dried beef for 3 months. But because the principle underneath all of it, the idea that the body's capacity expands to meet sustained demand and contracts when demand is removed, is not historical. It is biological. It is happening right now in every person reading this. The question is only whether the demands being placed on the system are large enough to trigger adaptation, or small enough to allow slow, quiet decline. The cowboy knew nothing about mitochondria. Nothing about cortisol curves or fat oxidation or brown adipose tissue. He knew the sun came up and the work was there, and you rode until the work was done, and you slept until the dark lifted, and you did it again. He knew the land was not going to adjust for him. He knew the cattle didn't care about his sore back or his chapped hands or his 4 hours of sleep. And in not caring, the land taught him something that we have spent a century trying to bottle in a lab and sell back to ourselves. That the body is not a machine that breaks down under demand. It is a machine that builds up because of it. The Wild West didn't build cowboys who couldn't get tired by sparing them from fatigue. It built them by making fatigue irrelevant. By loading every hour of every day with the kind of sustained, unavoidable, moderate demand that human physiology was designed to meet, the open frontier produced a class of working people whose physical endurance was not exceptional by intention but by environment. By system. By the slow, patient, relentless pressure of a world that had no interest in their comfort, and every interest in their output. And the body, as it has always done, answered. It answered in muscle fiber and mitochondria. In recalibrated cortisol and compressed recovery cycles. In a nervous system that learned to run the long miles without alarm, without emergency, without the luxury of stopping to feel how tired it was. Because the cattle were moving. And the sun was already halfway up the sky. And the dust was rising in the distance where the herd had gone ahead. And there was nothing left to do but ride. If this kind of history, the kind that lives in the dirt and the muscle and the forgotten science of men who never wrote a paper about what they knew, if that is the kind of story that pulls you in, then you are exactly who this channel was built for. Subscribe and turn on the notification bell. There is a great deal more ground to cover, and we are just getting started.